I was on the porch of a rented condo in the middle of the only vacation I'd taken in 2 years when my phone buzzed with a text from my father that would end up unraveling a plan he apparently thought was already finished. He wrote, "We're selling the beach house. Need the cash for your brother's new house." I set my coffee down on the railing and read it 3 times, because for a moment I genuinely thought he'd meant to send it to someone else entirely. My name is Elena. I'm 34, and that Saturday morning, sitting on a rented porch with a cooling cup of coffee, was the first time in 3 years I found out my parents had apparently forgotten something rather significant about a piece of property I'd been quietly carrying on my back the entire time. The beach house isn't large or fancy. It's a 2-bedroom place on a barrier island about 2 hours from where my parents live, purchased by my grandparents in the 70s, back when that stretch of coastline was still considered unremarkable rather than the increasingly expensive real estate it's become. My parents inherited it when my grandmother passed, and for the first several years, it functioned the way family beach houses often do, a shared, informal gathering place used by whoever wanted it, maintained by whoever happened to have the time and money that particular season. That changed around 6 years ago, when the property tax on the island jumped sharply after a county-wide reassessment, and the mortgage my parents had refinanced against the house years earlier suddenly came with a payment that didn't comfortably fit into their retirement budget anymore. I remember the phone call where my mother first brought this up, not as a request exactly, more as a kind of worried observation, wondering out loud whether they'd need to consider selling. I offered, somewhat impulsively, to help cover the mortgage payment each month, mostly because I couldn't imagine the house leaving the family and because at the time I had a stable enough income to absorb the extra expense without much strain. What started as a temporary bridge turned into 6 years of me quietly paying the full mortgage payment on that house, every single month, through an automatic transfer set up directly from my checking account to theirs, which they then forwarded to the lender. I never made a formal announcement about this to the rest of the family. It simply became part of my monthly routine, the way rent or a car payment is, something I budgeted around without much fanfare. Looking back, I think part of why I never made a bigger deal out of it was that the house genuinely meant something to me beyond obligation. My grandmother used to let me stay up late on the screened porch during summer visits, teaching me card games while my parents and Grant slept, and something about continuing to fund that place felt less like charity toward my parents and more like continuing a thread that connected back to her. I didn't need anyone else in the family to understand that connection for it to matter to me. I just kept paying, month after month, without asking for acknowledgement, because the acknowledgement I actually wanted, my grandmother's approval, wasn't something anyone else could give me anyway. There were a few years in there where the payments genuinely stretched my budget more than I let on. One winter, a slow stretch at my job meant I had to dip into savings twice just to keep the transfer going on schedule, something I never mentioned to my parents at the time because I didn't want them to worry, or worse, offer to sell the house out of guilt over my situation. In hindsight, that instinct to protect them from the full weight of what I was carrying may have contributed to exactly the kind of forgetting that led to that Saturday morning text. If I'd been more vocal about the sacrifice, maybe the mortgage payments would have stayed more present in their minds as an ongoing real obligation rather than something that simply happened quietly in the background. I sat on that porch for a long moment after reading my father's text, watching a couple walk their dog slowly along the water below, trying to figure out how to respond to a sentence that had apparently erased 6 years of payments from his memory entirely. 10 minutes later, before I'd managed to type anything, my mother added her own message to the thread. "It's in our name, we can do what we want." I remember reading that particular line and feeling something shift from confusion into something colder, because it wasn't just dismissive of the money I'd contributed, it was actively asserting a legal fact that I was fairly sure, based on paperwork I'd signed 3 years earlier, wasn't accurate anymore. Then my brother Grant weighed in. Grant is 2 years younger than me, recently engaged, currently house hunting with his fiancée in a market that had apparently outpriced what they'd originally budgeted for. He wrote, "It's not like you live there." I sat with that sentence longer than either of the other two, mostly because it was true in the narrowest possible sense and completely beside the point in every way that actually mattered. I didn't live there. I also hadn't missed a single mortgage payment in 6 years, hadn't asked for anything in return, and had, as far as I remembered, signed something related to the property's ownership status a few years back that none of them seemed to be factoring into this conversation at all. I want to back up and explain that paperwork, because it's the part of this story that ended up mattering most. 3 years ago, during a period when my parents were meeting regularly with a financial advisor to sort out their retirement planning, the advisor had raised a concern about the beach house sitting in my parents' name while I was the one effectively paying for it every month. He explained that if anything happened to my parents, the house would go through their estate rather than passing directly to whoever had actually been maintaining it financially, and that from a tax and liability standpoint, it made more sense to formally transfer the deed into my name while they were still alive, especially since I was the one carrying the mortgage anyway. My parents agreed. My father actually seemed relieved by the suggestion at the time, and the transfer was completed through their attorney a few months later. I signed where I needed to sign, filed the paperwork away, and didn't think about it much beyond that, since practically speaking, nothing about how the house was used or who visited it had changed at all. Apparently, in the 3 years since, my parents had simply stopped thinking about that transfer entirely, reverting back to an assumption of ownership that hadn't been legally accurate since that meeting with the advisor. I don't think this was a deliberate lie on their part, at least not consciously. I think it was closer to a kind of quiet forgetting, the way people sometimes stop tracking a fact once it no longer feels emotionally true to them, even when the paperwork says otherwise. I didn't respond to any of the 3 texts that first hour. I finished my coffee, went back inside to find my laptop, and pulled up the folder where I kept scanned copies of anything related to the house. The deed was there, filed under the date of the transfer, with both my parents' signatures and mine, notarized, recorded with the county clerk's office. I read through it slowly, partly to steady myself, partly because I wanted to be completely certain before I said anything back. While I had the folder open, I noticed something else that made the situation more urgent than I'd initially realized. Tucked behind the deed was an email chain I'd forgotten about, from about 2 weeks earlier, that I'd been copied on almost as an afterthought. My father had reached out to a real estate agent, a family friend named Douglas who'd sold properties on the island for years, asking him to come take a look at the house and give them a sense of current market value. Douglas had replied enthusiastically, mentioning that inventory on the island was low that season and that he could likely have it listed within the week if they were serious. I hadn't thought much of that email chain when it first came through, assuming it was a casual conversation rather than an actual plan already in motion. Reading it again now, with my father's text sitting fresh on my phone, I realized they weren't simply considering selling. They'd already started the process, with an agent who had no reason to know the deed had changed hands 3 years earlier, since nobody had bothered to tell him. That detail is what actually worried me, more than the disagreement itself. If Douglas listed the house and someone made an offer, there was a real chance of a genuinely messy legal situation unfolding, an agent representing sellers who no longer legally owned the property, a buyer potentially entering into a contract that could later be voided, my parents facing possible liability for misrepresenting ownership, even if their confusion was sincere rather than intentional. This wasn't just a family disagreement about fairness anymore. It was actively heading toward a legal problem that could hurt everyone involved, including people outside the family who had nothing to do with any of this. I called Douglas directly, before responding to my family at all, mostly because I wanted to stop any forward motion on the listing before it went any further. He was surprised to hear from me, and even more surprised when I explained the ownership situation. He confirmed he hadn't listed anything publicly yet, that he was still in the stage of preparing paperwork and getting photos scheduled, and he thanked me, somewhat awkwardly, for catching the issue before it became a real problem for his business as well. Douglas mentioned something during that call that stuck with me afterward, that he'd actually noticed something odd while pulling preliminary title information for his own file. A discrepancy between the name on file with the county and the name my father had given him verbally as the owner, but that he'd assumed it was simply an error in the county's system rather than an actual change in ownership, since my father had spoken about the house so confidently as his own. That detail told me something important. The paperwork had been sitting there, quietly correct, the entire time. It had taken someone outside the family, someone with no emotional investment in the story we'd all been telling ourselves, to even notice the discrepancy at all. And even then, he'd talked himself out of taking it seriously. He asked if I wanted him to reach out to my father directly to clarify, and I told him I'd prefer to handle that conversation myself first. Only then did I respond to the family group text. I didn't lead with anger, though I felt plenty of it sitting underneath the words I chose. I wrote a single message, attaching a scanned copy of the recorded deed. I think there's some confusion here. The house was transferred into my name 3 years ago, during the meeting with the financial advisor, remember? I've been paying the full mortgage every month since before that transfer even happened. I also want everyone to know Douglas hasn't listed anything publicly yet, so there's no urgency here that can't be sorted out calmly. The thread went quiet for almost 2 hours, which felt significant given how quickly the first 3 messages had come in that morning. When my father finally responded, his tone had changed considerably from the confident, decision-already-made energy of his first text. Okay, we need to sit down and talk about this. No defensiveness, no immediate pushback on the deed itself, just an acknowledgement that something he'd apparently forgotten had resurfaced at an inconvenient moment. I drove back from vacation 2 days early, partly because I didn't want this hanging over the rest of my trip, and partly because I genuinely wanted to understand how my parents had managed to forget something as significant as a property transfer they'd both signed themselves. I sat down with them at their kitchen table, the same table where, 3 years earlier, we'd all discussed the financial advisor's suggestion in the first place. My father explained, somewhat sheepishly, that once the transfer paperwork was filed, the house had simply continued functioning exactly as it always had, in his mind. He still thought of it as the family beach house, still referred to it that way in conversation, still made informal plans about its future without factoring in that a formal, legal change had occurred. My mother added that the recent property tax increase and the pressure of Grant's house hunting had made the idea of selling feel urgent enough that neither of them had stopped to double-check the actual paperwork before reaching out to Douglas. I asked them directly why, if they believed the house was still legally theirs, they hadn't at least mentioned the plan to me before contacting an agent, given that I'd been the one paying the mortgage for 6 years regardless of whose name was on the deed. My mother didn't have a clean answer for that. She said something about not wanting to make it complicated, which struck me as an odd thing to say about a decision that involved selling a house I'd been financially responsible for the entire time, deed or no deed. We spent close to 2 hours at that table, going through the situation in more detail than we probably ever had. I learned things during that conversation I hadn't fully understood before, including that Grant's house hunting troubles were more serious than I'd realized, that he and his fiancée had lost out on 2 separate offers already due to being outbid, and that my parents had genuinely believed selling the beach house was the fastest, cleanest way to help him catch up in a market that felt increasingly out of reach. I understood the impulse behind their plan, even as I remained frustrated by the way they'd gone about it, contacting an agent and announcing a decision before ever checking with the person whose name was actually on the property. At one point during that conversation, my mother pulled out a folder of her own, mortgage statements she'd apparently been keeping for years, and slid it across the table toward me without much explanation. I opened it and found nearly 6 years of records, every payment I'd sent, documented on her end in a spreadsheet I never knew existed, with small handwritten notes in the margins some months, things like Elena covered late fee or raised payment after tax increase. Seeing my own sacrifice reflected back at me in her handwriting, tracked so carefully despite the confusion over the deed, complicated the anger I'd been carrying into that conversation. She clearly hadn't been oblivious to what I was doing. She'd simply compartmentalized it separately from the question of who legally owned the house, in a way that made sense to her but had never quite been communicated to me. I told them, as plainly as I could, that I wasn't opposed in principle to helping Grant, but that any decision about a house legally in my name needed to include me from the beginning, not as a formality to be corrected after the fact, but as an actual participant in the conversation. My father agreed, somewhat quietly, and admitted that the ease of his original text, announcing the sale as already decided, had come from years of thinking about the house as fundamentally theirs to direct, regardless of what the paperwork said. Grant called me separately a few days after that kitchen table conversation, and this exchange went differently than the group text had, warmer than I expected given how the thread had started that Saturday morning. He apologized for the "it's not like you live there" comment, admitting it had been a lazy thing to say, something he'd typed quickly out of frustration about his own housing situation rather than something he'd actually thought through regarding my 6 years of mortgage payments. I appreciated the apology, though I also gently pointed out that his frustration about house hunting, while understandable, didn't change the fact that the beach house wasn't simply available for redistribution because his own plans had hit a setback. He told me more about the house hunt during that call than he had in months, the 2 lost offers, the growing tension with his fiancée over whether they should expand their search radius, the quiet fear that they might have to delay the wedding if a down payment didn't come together soon. I hadn't realized how much pressure he'd been under, mostly because Grant has always been the kind of person who keeps that sort of stress private until it spills out sideways, in comments like the one that had started this whole mess. Hearing the fuller picture didn't excuse the comment, but it did help me understand where it had come from. In the weeks that followed, we worked out an arrangement that ended up satisfying most of what everyone actually needed, once we stopped operating from outdated assumptions about who owned what. I agreed to help Grant and his fiancée with a portion of their down payment directly, an amount I chose myself based on what I could actually afford, rather than the full value that selling the beach house outright would have generated. We sat down together, just the 2 of us, to work out a specific number, one that felt meaningful without putting my own finances at risk the way 6 years of mortgage payments already had. In exchange, the beach house stayed exactly where it was, in my name, with my parents continuing to use it whenever they wanted, the way the whole family always had, except now with an accurate understanding of who was actually financially responsible for it. I want to be honest that this resolution wasn't purely generous on my part. I genuinely didn't want to see the beach house sold, both because of what it meant to me personally, tied as it was to childhood summers with my grandparents, and because 6 years of mortgage payments had made it feel, in a very real sense, like mine, independent of the deed itself. Helping Grant directly let me address his actual need without sacrificing something I'd already invested so heavily in protecting. My relationship with my parents has settled into something calmer since that conversation, though not without some lingering awkwardness. My father brought up the deed transfer again a few weeks later, unprompted, saying he'd gone back and reread the paperwork carefully for the first time since signing it 3 years ago. He admitted he was somewhat embarrassed by how completely he'd let the legal reality slip from his memory, especially given that he'd been the one to suggest the transfer felt right at the time it happened. My mother has been quieter about the whole thing, though she did, a month or so later, thank me for handling Douglas the way I had, Acknowledging that letting the listing go further without correcting the ownership issue could have caused real problems for everyone, including for Douglas's professional reputation. My father and I had one more conversation about it, over the phone this time, a couple of months after everything had settled. He told me he'd started keeping a small note taped inside his desk drawer at home, a reminder of the deed transfer date and what it meant, something he said felt almost silly to need, but that he wanted some physical marker to prevent the same kind of forgetting from happening again, whether about this house or anything else down the line. I found that admission more reassuring than any formal apology could have been. It suggested he'd actually absorbed something from the experience, rather than simply moving past the discomfort of the conversation and letting the underlying pattern continue unaddressed. There was an awkward stretch too that I don't want to leave out. At a family dinner about 6 weeks after the kitchen table conversation, my mother made an offhand comment about when we eventually sell the house someday, clearly not intending anything by it, just an old verbal habit surfacing out of years of thinking about the property that way. I didn't say anything in the moment, but I noticed my father catch it too, giving her a small look across the table, and later that night he mentioned to me privately that he'd gently corrected her afterward, once we weren't all sitting together. Small moments like that told me the shift in understanding wasn't instant or total. It was going to take longer than one conversation for the old habit of thought to fully catch up with the paperwork. I've thought a lot, since all of this happened, about how easily a formal, deliberate legal decision can get quietly overwritten by years of habit and old assumptions, even among people who signed the paperwork themselves and had every intention of honoring it. My parents weren't lying when they said the house was in their name. They were simply operating on an outdated memory of their own decision, one that had never been reinforced by anything beyond a single afternoon at an attorney's office 3 years earlier. Nothing about daily life at that house had changed to remind them the transfer had actually happened. No new mailbox label, no different set of keys, nothing visible enough to keep the fact present in their minds the way the deed itself, on paper, plainly stated it. I've started wondering, too, whether this kind of drift happens more often in families than any of us realize, precisely because the emotional experience of a place tends to move so much slower than the legal reality attached to it. The beach house had felt like my parents' house for decades before any transfer happened, and 3 years apparently wasn't enough time to overwrite 4 decades of accumulated habit. Not fully. Not without some kind of ongoing reminder built into daily life. I don't think that excuses what happened, the casual announcement that the house was simply being sold, the dismissive responses when I first pushed back, but it has made me less interested in framing this as a story about deliberate betrayal, and more interested in what it reveals about how fragile even signed, notarized agreements can be against the pull of long-standing family habit. I mentioned all of this months later to a coworker, Simone, during a slow afternoon at the office, mostly as a kind of passing anecdote about a strange family situation rather than anything I expected her to relate to directly. She surprised me by saying something similar had happened in her own family, though with a car rather than a house. Her father having transferred title of an old truck to her years earlier for insurance reasons, then continuing to lend it out to cousins and treat it as communal property long after the paperwork said otherwise. She said she'd never bothered correcting anyone about it, mostly because a truck felt like too small a thing to make a fuss over. But hearing my story made her wonder whether the same quiet drift was happening with other, larger things in her family that she simply hadn't noticed yet. I don't know if she ever went looking, but I think about that conversation sometimes, how a fairly narrow situation involving one house ended up making someone else reconsider what else in her own life might be operating on outdated assumptions nobody had thought to double-check. I mentioned this whole situation to a friend of mine, Ren, who happens to work in estate law, though for an entirely unrelated matter at the time, and she told me this kind of quiet forgetting is more common than people assume, especially with property transfers done for tax or estate planning reasons rather than because of any actual shift in how a family uses a space. She said she often recommends clients revisit these kinds of arrangements every few years, specifically because the paper reality and the emotional reality of ownership can drift apart so easily once the initial urgency of the original meeting fades. I still have the deeds saved in that same folder, along with the email chain with Douglas, not because I expect to need either of them again anytime soon, but because I've learned, over the past few months, that the story a family tells itself about who owns what can shift quietly enough that even the people who signed the original paperwork can lose track of it. Having the actual documents on hand isn't about distrust exactly. It's more like insurance against the particular kind of forgetting that seems to happen whenever emotional habit and legal fact stop lining up the way they did on the day everyone originally agreed to something. I've also started keeping a simple, informal habit of my own since all of this happened. A short annual conversation, usually around the anniversary of my grandmother's passing, where I sit down with my parents and briefly review anything financial or legal connected to the house, not out of suspicion, but as a small yearly correction against the kind of drift that caused this whole situation in the first place. My father, half joking, calls it the beach house meeting now, and it's become, oddly enough, one of the calmer, more grounding conversations we have as a family each year. A chance to say the true thing out loud together before enough time passes for anyone to start forgetting it again. So here's what I keep turning over, months later, sitting on that same porch during a much calmer trip back to the island this past spring. How much of what we believe we own in a family is actually backed by anything solid, and how much of it is just a story we've told each other so many times that nobody bothers to check the paperwork anymore. And when those two things finally collide, the story and the deed, whose version gets to win, the one that's been repeated the longest around a dinner table for years, or the one that was actually signed, witnessed, and quietly filed away in a county office nobody thought to visit again, until a Saturday morning text made checking suddenly, unavoidably necessary.